Hey, 8th graders, Ms. Decker here. I am going to film our recap video from our lesson today for 22 about interviews, examples, and then kind of an outline that Ms. Tresick went over. So I want to get started with just a reminder of what your assignment was that we talked about on Monday during our Zoom. So Mr. Dickinson presented this in the last section of our instruction, and he talked about how what your task basically is to write a human interest piece related to COVID-19. So you are finding an untold story about a person or a group of people in our community that you think would be interesting. We're asking that you find two people to interview, one familiar, meaning someone that you live with, and then one unfamiliar. And when we say unfamiliar, we mean more someone who maybe doesn't live with you. And we know that we want to still stick within the guidelines of staying at least 6 feet away. So you could do this through a lot of different ways, and I'm going to go over those here very shortly. But you do want it to have a connection to our daily lives, and it should be timely. I've written the logistics down here. So some of you were asking about like a page number and how long this article should be. And I would say about 1 page, give or take. You can use 12-point font, and then Times New Roman is the normal font used for newspapers. And then if you are still kind of waiting to get started or struggling a little bit, this is that reminder of how you would potentially brainstorm. Mr. Dickinson in the top right corner here linked a brainstorm document, and that kind of chunks out the information if you want to use it. I highly recommend it. It's great for getting started. So, but remember, right, you think about what's happening in our world, what's a story that would be interesting to tell, gather that information, schedule an interview, and complete those, making sure that you have pre-made questions, which again, we're going to get into today. And then when you're writing, you want to think bigger picture. We'll talk a little bit more about theme and topic as we move forward with today's lesson. But this is due on Friday, right? Journalists have a really quick turnaround time. And since you are journalists this week, you are always writers and readers, but you have a deadline. So make sure that that is turned into Google Classroom on Friday. I know I'm opening one up today. Ms. Tresick's already opened up her Google Classroom, and I think Mr. Dickinson as well. So be watching for that. So let's get started with today's lesson. So interviews, right? What is it? Well, it's just a formal conversation. So it's not the informal type where you're just talking to a friend or someone that you know, but this is a formal conversation where you, the interviewer, prepares questions for the person to be interviewed, right? So you want to, the big thing here, the common theme that you're going to see with today's lesson is that you have to be prepared. And then kind of the question of like, why is this important to include? Well, people that you interview are experiencing this, and they are primary sources. We talked a lot about primary versus secondary over the last 2 lessons, and they are the primary source keepers. It also humanizes the topic, gives context and perspective, and it's a way to gather information that is qualitative. And not just like numbers and stats. It's very anecdotal and kind of gives a human voice and lends a human aspect to the stories and what we're experiencing right now. And then we pose the question of, should I wing it? Everything we just said, absolutely not, right? You want to be prepared for this interview, even if it's with someone that you know or someone that you're extremely close with. It's important that you are coming prepared. And so you might be asking yourself, right, how do I interview someone that I don't know or that, I don't have access to in my home? There are a lot of different ways. And I'm going to be honest with you, I accessed pretty much all of these when I was compiling my interview list. I went a little above and beyond and interviewed more than just 2 people. But basically, you can go face to face, right? When you interview someone that you live with, right, they are in your home. So this could be a neighbor, right? I have neighbors that I see across the fence and say hello to and have quick conversations with outside. And so as long as you're staying that 6 feet away, you could definitely have a face-to-face interview with your neighbor, right? Video or phone call. Right? Anyone who has a phone or has the video option, we have Zoom, right? You guys access that. You could utilize that. Or if you have like Skype or FaceTime on your phone, make sure you're gaining permission from whoever you live with and that's okay to call someone, but those are really great options. Email is also another one. If a phone call isn't possible, email is great. If you're wanting to access any of your teachers or anyone that works at the school, email is perfect. You could email a list of questions. I know Ms. Tresick actually used Facebook and posed a couple questions on Facebook and got some really great responses. And then the last thing, you could text someone. I utilize this when I had a quick question that I forgot to ask, or I was writing the article and I was like, oh shoot, I wish I would have asked this question. And it was someone a close friend. So I, sent them a quick text and got an answer, and I was able to do that. I would not recommend using text messaging for the bulk of your interview, but it's great for a quick follow-up if you're writing and you just want a quick response. That way, then you're not having to take the time to call, and you could just get it in writing instead of having to record it. So those are all the different ways that you can connect with people during this time of quarantine, where you normally might be able to actually go visit them. And then this next section here, I want to talk to you about prepping for an interview. I posted an additional resource right here, this 5 journalistic tips for conducting a better interview. If you're still like, I might need some more information, that's a great article to click on and read. But basically, these bullet points here are some of the things that we want you to think about when you are preparing your interview. You have to know your subject. You're really lucky if you're interviewing that person that you live with. You know them well, you live with them, right? But if it's someone that you don't know as well, maybe give yourself a couple questions at the beginning of the beginning of the interview and get to know them a little bit, or have a quick conversation and then start into your formal interview. That might be a great idea, just to get to know them a little bit better. Over prepare, right? You don't want to come up short or, basically not have asked the right questions. Then when you get writing your article, you're like, oh shoot, I wish I would have asked this and this and this, right? And have to conduct a whole second interview. So have the article kind of that you want to write in your mind before. You don't necessarily want to guide them and you don't want to be biased, but you have an idea. Like when I decided to write my story, I first thought I want to feature my sister because she just had a baby, and I'm really good friends with Mr. Burke and his wife, and they just had a baby yesterday as well. And so I was like, oh gosh, what a crazy time. And then I started thinking about celebrations in general. So I started thinking about like, how do we find moments of joy in kind of these crazy times, even when, we can't celebrate in the ways we normally do. And that became the way that I structured my questions, was like, how do you find ways to still stay excited about all of these things that are happening, even though you don't get to have the big birthday celebrations or, big baptisms, or, you can't have friends over to see, your new children. And so trying to take it from a more optimistic standpoint was the goal. And so you can have that in mind when you're creating your questions. Secondly, have a list of 8 to 10 open-ended questions prepared, right? Open-ended just means that it can't be a yes or no answer, that they have to elaborate. And then you might have some follow-up questions prepared as well, right? Kind of on the opposite sides of things, if you are so over-prepared, you can allow yourself to go off book, right? Don't be afraid to ask questions that you didn't write down if the conversation is flowing that way. Yes, your interviews are a formal conversation, but that doesn't mean that you can't let the conversation flow and ask questions that are follow-ups. Like, for example, I might ask someone how they celebrated their birthday, and this actually happened. My friend said that she ended up going in the community garden and planting and really spending the time outside. And I said, oh, like, do you have a new appreciation for being outside? And that kind of brought us into a whole different thing. And I got some really great answers from her about just the quarantine in general and how she's been spending her time. And then relax, right? Start with that familiar person first, and that way then you're more comfortable with the subject and the topic and the person that you're talking to. And just have a conversation, right? Just like the above bullet point, don't be afraid to let that conversation flow. It doesn't have to be rigid, even if it is formal. And then the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about is I posted just a couple examples that I used, and I tailored them a little bit differently depending on if I was talking about a birthday celebration or the celebration of someone having a baby. But these were just, kind of the basics or the outline of the questions that I was asking. And then, right, if we think about how we want to, went a little too far there. How we take interviews to an article. Ms. Tresik talked about this when we were in our Zoom session, and we talked about how like you have to at first identify the person that you're interviewing. You want to use their full name. You might want to include where they're from, what they do. You have to use dialogue tags or framing of the quotes. And again, I'm going to show you that in an example here really shortly. Once you've identified the people or the person in your article that you're quoting, you only have to use their last name once you quote them again or when you're referring to them, right? So if I was talking about Mr. Dickinson, I would say like, it was a really great day, Mr. Dickinson said, period. Dickinson went on to say that, right? So I'm only using his last name. Make sure that you're inserting quotes to support different sections of the article. You don't want to just include random quotes. You want to make sure that there's a flow. And you could kind of follow, maybe you have set up your questions in the general outline that you want your article to flow. But you have to look at the answers and see what makes most sense and what is going to have the best flow. And so make sure you're also giving context, right? Quotes shouldn't just be the entire article. You want to have the framing paragraphs around them. And in that same note, like don't include the full interview. You won't be able to include everything that you've asked and that they've answered. So find the most relevant and impactful things, right? So I obviously, I talked to 4 different people and I spent a good chunk of time talking to them. And I probably only used, 2 quotes from each person or even 1 quote from some people. And that's no big deal, but I just took the most important information that made sense with the flow of my article. And then paraphrasing as a setup. You can take the information they provided and you can relay it through paraphrasing and then take that like one sentence that's the most powerful and include that. So that way then it's, it's you're paraphrasing and you can kind of shape the words how you want, and then you're using just that 1 quote. And so then here is Ms. Tresik's document for her D&D article that she wrote. And so basically she took the stance of like, how are people staying entertained and how are they still connecting with other individuals when playing role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. And so she here in this document that you have access to as well, you can see that she interviewed her sister, and this was a face-to-face interview. So she just typed up what was being said. And then she also asked questions to a fellow teacher, right? Trudy Kimball was a former teacher at Lewis Central, and she asked these questions on Facebook, and Ms. Kimball answered them. And then here were the core interview questions, right? She had 5, and from there she branched out with each person, depending on how they answered with follow-up questions, but these were the core questions that she asked. And then from there, she created an outline. So you can see here, right? Self-isolation cannot stop escape to different worlds, different comforts. And so she just followed Mr. Dickinson's outline that he introduced on Monday. And so if you look through here, right, you can see, I'm actually going to go back to the slides because she posted her edits. But you can see here, right, that she introduced Natalie, who earlier in the article, and then right here, you can see where I'm kind of hovering, where she just uses her last name of Pope, right? And then she quotes, right? She kind of gives some background, adds some context. And then down here, you can see where she added a note, right? We set up a time and know when to be online, and it's always on Discord, right? Right here, you'll notice that it's in brackets. So there's something really important there. Natalie must have said something like, we set up a time and know when to be on there. And that was really vague. So Ms. Tresik inserted the word online so the audience and the readers would know what Natalie meant. But because Natalie didn't say it, she has to add brackets so that the reader knows that Ms. Tresik altered the text. And then you can see again right here where it says in the second paragraph, right, Trudy Nielsen Kimball, an educator at Wilson Middle School and a sponsor of Tabletop Group, is continuing to play as well, right? So it says her name, gives some background information about her, and then again when she's quoted just right here, it's just her last name, right? And so if you think these things that we just taught up here were 100% included, right? And if you read Ms. Tresik's article, you can see that it's not just quotes, right? And that she's also included just some background information about what's going on and her connection. And so another thing that came up in our Zoom session was having someone else look at your piece, right? I'm not someone who plays Dungeons and Dragons, so I am helping Ms. Tresik and I'm looking at this piece and making sure that she's not using, and she's very well versed, right? Making sure that she's not using shorthand that like just someone who doesn't play D&D, would understand. That way then I can ask questions and say, oh, what did you mean by this? Or, oh, this might be a little bit biased. So if you're picking something that you're really close to, like I am with my subjects and like Ms. Tresik is with this game, you might want to have someone else take another look at it, or take a step back and make sure that you're not adding in any bias as well. So that would be a good option. And then the last thing to think about is this idea of revision, right? And so Mr. Dickinson took this section and he talked a lot about this idea of theme and creating this kind of even flow throughout your article. You don't want to introduce everything right up front, right? You don't want to just tell them the theme or tell them everything. You want to introduce your subjects and you want to kind of guide them along, right? Let the interview and direct that story. Really let the voices of the people that you interview kind of like take people along that journey, right? And keeping it narrow. Some of you asked questions in the Zoom about what this should be about COVID-19. It's like, absolutely, it should be about someone in our community and how this quarantine, this pandemic has affected them, and how it could be a relatable story, right? Include content vocabulary, make a list ahead of time, right? So I talked a lot about things with doctor's offices and different celebrations, right? Ms. Tresik used a lot of D&D information. Mr. Dickinson focused on this idea of being pregnant, and because his wife is pregnant, right? And he also knows Mr. Burke pretty well and talked about how his wife is pregnant, right? And they're kind of going through that same thing. And so that was the focus of his article, right? And don't make assumptions about statistics, right? There's a lot of information out there. This is the part of the article that you would want to Google because you want to provide some broader context for what's going on. And so make sure that you're doing your research. Same thing when we talked about this being a formal interview or a formal conversation, you want to use formal language, right? Eliminate contractions and slang. If those are just little things, instead of saying don't, say do not. Don't use words that are more colloquialisms or slang terms. Watch for repeated language. Make sure that you are varying your word choice. And then think about theme, right? You get to control the narrative. Mr. Dickinson talked about how with great power comes great responsibility. You can edit a story into a lot of different things, right? There's, I think, a really cool example is that commercial. It's a car insurance commercial, and it's these two people, and they're saying the same exact line, but it's all with their inflection. What happened? One guy's car crashed and another girl is getting a car for the first time. And so he's saying, is that my car? Right. And she's saying, is that my car? Right. And so they're saying the same thing. And so you can control the spin on this. And so, make sure that you're representing the people you're interviewing well and accurately, and not letting your own opinions, stray you away from what's really happening, and plan ahead for the theme, right? Like I said, I kind of had this idea of these joyous moments in the back of my head, and trying to find happiness even in times that are a little tough. So plan ahead, but just be sure that if the interview takes you somewhere else, that's okay, and you can adjust from there. And then be sure to connect to your audience, right? This should be relevant. This should be relatable. It should be timely. It should be something that's interesting for people to read. So that is all I have for you today for our recap video. If you have any questions, please reach out, and your teacher or, all of your teachers are happy to help. I hope everybody has a great day. Remember, we do not have any school on Friday, so please do your Flipgrid tomorrow and make sure that your article is turned into Google Classroom by Friday morning. All right, have a great day, everybody.